Now we are back, Kristen. A very warm welcome all the way from Ontario. It is evening time there with you, I think, or it's like late afternoon, correct?
Late afternoon, yeah. It's just before 4 p.m. Yeah.
Super. It's very late with Andrew. It's not so late with Isolde, and it's kind of late with me, but we're going to get through this. Thank you again for joining us. Last week, we had such a superb reaction. We reran your conversation with Isolde. Honestly, I watched it. I was traveling back I was actually was I in Kaliningrad? I was in Kaliningrad. I was. And this sounds strange. I was sitting in a restaurant, and it went out twice. It went out on Sunday and again on Monday. And I was sitting in a restaurant watching it, and people were looking just like, why was I smiling? Why was I kind of giggling at times? And thinking, what am I doing as I'm eating my pasta carbonara? Anyway.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed the show. I enjoyed the carbonara. They're both equally good. So look, first up, I'm going to just put this up on screen. This was a couple of weeks ago when we've discussed this. This was Seth Coe there. I can't say a friend of the show. He's written us letters that we have to like stop attacking him and so on. They tightened the rules on transgender athletes. It was a huge shock to the system. A lot of people were taken aback by it. They saw it coming, but not to the level and the sort of the way that has played out across the media as well.
Yeah.
Kristen, you've been speaking with people I know. I've read what you have been presenting as well online, and what like sort of the points you've been putting forward, which have been so accurate, so to the point.
Right.
What's the feeling at the moment with transgender athletes? How are they feeling more isolated than ever? And especially in track and field, do they feel that, oh my God, like we're being made a scapegoat and it's not fair?
Yeah, I think, Alan, I mean, first of all, it's great to be on the show and great to see everybody. And I appreciate having the opportunity to kind of reconnect with you and talk about it from the longer conversation that Isolde and I had, I guess, a couple months ago, that you were just reflecting on. And I think the biggest thing right now is, I mean, I feel it personally myself in terms of I feel the anxiety. Living here in Ontario, I happen to have that background. I have that knowledge base that you're just kind of saying some of the things that I'm very specific to the point. But there's reasons why I'm specific to the point is because I have that lived experience, and I have that experience over the last 2 decades, and working with in this space as a survivor, as a transition athlete, and having gone through that with the International Olympic Committee literally over 2 decades. So I am very familiar with this space, and a lot of it has to do with the intersection between me and the International Olympic Committee over the last 2 decades. So for a lot of people who are unaware of that historical relationship is to where we are now, is the level of the disinformation and the impact that it's having globally. And I live on the border of here I live in Toronto, on the border of Canada and the United States, and the longest border in the world. And I wake up every morning with anxiety hearing the news coming out of the United States from the governors and issues around public health. And I think of those young children and families that are looking for help in their various communities across the United States as an example. And I can only imagine what that feels like. I know what it feels like as somebody who has lived this experience and had grown up with it myself, and what it's like to be in a space where you are being pushed away from your community, and the lack of resources and the ability to be able to get the healthcare needs that you need to be able to move into that space to make yourself healthy. And so it's very predominantly problematic, I feel, first person, because I went through this with the IOC, as you know, and I've been through this journey with them to where I feel like I'm complicit with this, with the IOC in some ways, because of what happened here in Toronto back in 2015, when I was able to take the IOC out of the Court of Arbitration and out of the autonomy of sport, to which we were successful here in Toronto. But a lot of the policy changes that were done at the time were reflective of that historical record. And the problem was is that the policies that were currently put in place in 2016 were not designed for the purpose of greater inclusion in sport. It was actually designed for the purpose of the IOC trying to limit their liability when they came into Toronto, and it was what I call a legal scheme. And it was never designed for the purpose of greater inclusion as they had perpetuated and kept in play for the last 5 years until I re-engaged with them back in late 2019, to which now they've fully pivoted 180 degrees, as you're well aware of now, which is based on that historical record between me and them. So the levity of the disinformation is profound. It's heartbreaking. It's disconnecting young people from participation, not just in community, but not just in sport, but in their communities. It's telling them that they're not good enough living in society. They're not worthy. And all these fundamental barriers that will impact their education, their relationships, their schooling, every aspect of their lives that is ongoing now, that a lot of people are just thinking about sport, which sport is a very small part of this bigger discussion. And everybody is unfortunately blowing this up beyond something that just doesn't exist.
On that, Kristen, just you're right. I mean, sport's what we're speaking about, but we know that for all of us, sport is more than just sport. Sport is life. Sport is something that gets you out of bed in the morning, whether it be to go out for a run like Andrew does, whether it be to walk the dogs like huskies, sorry, not dogs or huskies, like Giesel does, or to jump on a bike as you would. It's something that, drives us forward. It makes life worth living. So that's why I feel like a sport. What can be done? Like what's the hope? What can be done, Kristen? Because it's a subject that, and I'll speak with this in a second, with her ask a question in a second. But what can be done in your point of view?
Well, I know what can be done. I've actually been in that process with the IOC for the last 3 years, privately behind the scenes, to which I was able. I'm a survivor. I'm a recognized survivor from what had happened, that historical record. And the pivot that they've now made, that 180-degree pivot, didn't come by accident. Okay, that is a recognition of the last 2 decades and the disinformation and the lack of work that the IOC did on every previous policy before that. There was no science and research to any of the policies. So going far as back as 2003, when the idea of sex reassignment was part of the protocols, a prerequisite of the sport, there was no science and research behind any of it. And it was back in 2006 to where I was able to bring the government of Canada into a call with the IOC, which they would formally admit to never have done the science into the research that was published back in 2003, to which I was gender tested. So I was gender tested by 8 men over a very short period of time. And it was on that call when the IOC specifically admitted, at the IOC Medical Commission, admitted at the time to the Canadian government, we were all on the call together, that there was no science and research to the policy. So inevitably, in that moment, they realized, pardon me for saying, they break me psychologically and physically, purely based on knowing absolutely nothing. And I actually talk about this in my autobiography that was published by Penguin Random House in 2018. And I used the line, they felt they could, they felt they had a right, and I deserved it, they knowing absolutely nothing. And that was the absolute truth. So between that period of time through to 2014, the IOC, in collusion with the UCI, the World Anti-Doping Agency, and my own government, would collude for that period of time to prevent the world from knowing what happened to me and what I knew, until I was able to go outside the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland and pull the IOC out of the autonomy into the legal case here in Toronto, to which then they would try to flip the policy by removing sex reassignment on their own, because they knew they hadn't done the science and the research, and they never thought that I'd find the Achilles heel to pull them into a civil court application and human rights tribunal thereafter. That they had prepared to play the long game and using the shielding of the autonomy to do that and to prevent me, and hoping that one day, as the water lawyer said in the human rights tribunal at the time, he stood up in the court and said, "We thought one day Miss Worley was going to get tired." So they were prepared to play the long game. So the issue was, as a lot of my colleagues who know this historical record, and as the IOC does as well, is the policy that was developed in 2016 was never designed for the purpose of greater inclusion into sport. what they were trying to do is to limit the liability when they were coming into Toronto, because they had to answer to a court that they had no political interference or they had no political relationship to, and had to answer to the science, which they knew they couldn't do. So that's why that happened. It wasn't that the IOC was coming out and saying, "Oh my gosh, finally after 4 decades, we finally have changed our ways." That was never the case. The case is that I'd got them outside the autonomy, and they had to answer to a real court of law to why what they had done, and they couldn't do it. So they, on their own, before coming into Toronto on the February 2016, on the 20th of February that year, had changed the policy weeks before to help to eliminate that question in the court, to which inevitably was thrown out in Toronto. So the problem was at that point, if I can talk to that, was that when I walked out of the court with my lawyers on that day, when they had lost, and we all knew in our minds that the IOC wasn't going to tell anybody what they had done, because they'd already had pre-sold it to the public before they came into Toronto. So they didn't want to be, so Thomas Bloch was down in Rio weeks later, press conference in Rio, talking about the policy. He didn't talk about what happened in Toronto. He continued to support the policy as it was, because they didn't want to let the world know what they had done. So that policy laid in place for 5 years until I would re-engage with them back in the late 2019, which I would spend the next 2.5 years working with them to flip this whole conversation 180 degrees to actually doing the work, to which I've actually been in a formal reconciliation with them privately behind the scenes because of the liability of this historical record.
Kristen, I'll let you guys come in a second. There was something when I was home, I was discussing this with a very good friend of mine who has 3 daughters, and we were discussing it because it was we'd seen actually on the news as we're sitting in the pub, and he turned to me and said, "What's your opinion?" So you have a daughter, what would you? And I was like, "Well, I don't know." I said, "I really don't know." I said I couldn't decide either way. His opinion was, I want to let them play a field. He just said them, but again, this guy's so open, decent person. He said, let them have a different category.
No.
Is that what we're looking at now, Kristen? That, like, because there is this kind of battle that which I don't like.
I think a great question, and I don't like the question either. I think what this comes out of, again, the hyperbole to which this has been happening since 2020, when around Leah Thomas and a few other athletes who came out on the policy based on what happened here in Toronto. Again, I'm coming back to that history because this is really important, because the IOC knew back in 2005, 2006, the impact of sex reassignment. We know the impact to the human physiology. So athletes who had sex reassignment, so that is the recreation of the vulva and the removal of the body's ability to generate hormones. There's a tremendous impact to the endocrine system. Those athletes specifically are grossly impacted with long-term health implications accelerated by sporting activity, period. We know that, and it happens within a 10-year window. With the issue of specific athletes that we're talking about, the ones that we're talking about here, in terms of the ones that have not been through the surgical intervention of their bodies, so the creation of the vulva and the removal of the ability to generate hormones, and they have had hormone suppression, they haven't had that same impact to their physiology. It is a very different body type. They haven't had that same impact to the physiology. And there's a very known science called hypogonadism, which is in somebody who is XY chromosome, so a male physiology, or quote unquote male physiology. When you lower the testosterone, we know the impact to the human physiology, what happens to that individual when you have low testosterone. We get therapeutic use exemptions from WADA to support that, because we know when you lower the testosterone, which is the primary hormone of that body, it makes that person unwell. Okay, so for people to say that the science and the research doesn't exist, completely untrue. It's been put up into this hyperbole and this narrative that is inaccurate. It's creating fear and all these other anxieties that are unconscionable. And that's the unfortunate piece. What we need to be able to do is to understand how we got here. So that's why I keep coming back to the policy situation here in Toronto, because those athletes who are now participating, and where this narrative is being discussed, is around those athletes and that policy. And what I'm saying is that the IOC never designed that policy for greater inclusion. There's no science and research behind that policy. It's purely to alleviate the liability that they were being dealt with here in Toronto between me and them. That's it. So the athletes don't know any better that the policies to which they're participating, same with the federations and the local communities of sport and governments under the signatory relationship to the IOC, they don't know better because the IOC hasn't told anybody.
Before we go to ESO first, before we do, Kristen, is it okay if I put on screen, because people won't understand, and I'm going to very briefly describe it, your TUE. Would that be okay?
Absolutely. Please do. And I think that's really important.
No, you shared it publicly, but again, I want to do it in the correct way and do it out of respect for you. So this here, as you can see, is a TUE, a therapeutic use exemption. Now we've spoken about this very often. We spoke about the abuse of TUEs on capital sports. We spoke about how they've been granted in the wrong way. There's also ways around this as well, that people will say, "Oh, I have asthma," and they get them. We're not going to talk about Liverpool or any other football club or athletes or footballers. This is what was given to Kristen. This is to replace the natural testosterone that her body, being born, as she said, with XY chromosomes, that her body needed to survive, because we know, men know, as you get older, I believe I've stopped sharing that now. Is that right? Yeah, I've stopped sharing. So as men get older, the testosterone level gradually decreases. So there are side effects of that.
Right.
Men, then we see them then where athletes superdose on testosterone, end up dropping dead, end up with their testicles shrinking. We end up with all these things. But when someone who's gone through a full transition, they need it. So again,
if I can explain one thing, what's
sure, please, yeah, please.
Is that TUE was 2009. Okay, so that date is really important for everybody to understand. To understand, we knew the science back then. It's okay. We're now in 2023. Okay, so we knew the science back in 2000, because this actually came up in 2006. Okay, that's when I started going through this, and because my body had lost the ability to generate any hormone, and obviously when you create the vulva, there's a physical break in the endocrine system. There's a physical break. Okay, so the body, the brain then disconnects from that interaction with the rest of the body's organs and function and ability to be able to support itself over time. Okay, so that's what's really important. And to understand that TUE took me 3 years to get, which usually takes 2 to 3 weeks for the average human being. So you can imagine the average athlete. So you can imagine the politic in that, because at that time I was getting threats from Dick Pound. I was getting legal threats from John Fahey, who, when he was the CEO of WADA, telling me to be quiet. And they were trying to silence me because they were trying to protect Arnie Lindquist because of what I do. Right. And also I had been gender tested through the process years before. And so they knew it was a complete liability to what had happened. And they didn't want the world to know what had happened.
Iseult, again, with TUEs, I can attest to it that they are easy to get when you have all your ducks in a row. That's that, and I'm not exaggerating with that. If you have the tests done, the whole lot, I'm not talking about the dodgy TUEs, I'm talking about the real ones. A couple people I work with, where they got, there's like different levels as well that they can get them, but the main one is when they need something that's like could be pain medicine. I mentioned before, I think before, it was like someone was going through chemo, so you have to get a TUE to show they're going through chemo. It was very easy to get because we had all the documents. But anyway, Iseult, sorry, I'm going to just bring you in this. You wanted to come back on something with Kristen.
Well, I suppose just what we've discussed about TUEs there, and I think Kristen made the point, and I don't know if it was during our discussion or in her book, that her doctor, because her doctor, their area of knowledge is specifically knowing in advance of anything that had gone on with the case and any of the issues that went on, that she was going to have this reaction. There's a fix, as she mentioned, the decade. There's a cliff coming that you're going to go over if you're not getting your TUE, and like testosterone issue is there. It was a known beforehand. So it's kind of frightening. And I think it's also extremely, particularly, and I'm going to say it's going to be particularly around cis women from what I've seen online, and from what I continue to see more and more of. And I think I'm more acutely aware now, and I'm really glad that I am, because now when I look at things, I kind of go, right, that is kind of terrifying. But people who have certain areas of expertise, or may have backgrounds in areas where, to someone who doesn't know any better, we look at what they're putting online, or we look at what they're saying, and we assume that they are experts in a particular area. They weaponize cis women in particular with the idea that there is all this research out there, that we are going to have our sports suddenly only being won by people who have transitioned, and that all of a sudden there needs to be an additional category, or we need to try and be upset or frustrated or annoyed that people are going to come in and win in every single competition. And the reality is so different. And I think when Kristen talks about the reactionary IOC efforts to simply put in place a policy, not in contemplation of actual future athletes, but basically was their way of going, we know we've been caught out because there's no research, so we have to put something in quickly so it looks good when we go to court, which is really frightening. And it's also really, it's disingenuous, because then for athletes, they suddenly realize, and hopefully more and more athletes are beginning to realize, that the only reason this policy exists is a legal safeguard. It's not about bringing people into the sport. And it also, probably to a large extent, and Chris, you might be able to tell me this, how much research was done before that policy came into being? Or was it just a case of going, okay, we had no research in our last one, let's put in place some form of policy and see where we go from there? But there is a frightening amount of weaponizing, particularly by people who will put things in their name that you would know, oh my God, they must be an expert in this area, or they will champion how much knowledge they have and how much research they've done, of really weaponizing cis women with this sort of idea that people who have transitioned are going to come to your sport and you will never participate or win again. And it's aimed at cis women as opposed to aimed at cis men.
I'll add on to that as well. Before, Kristen, you come back to this, please. Then we'll go to Andrew. I'll add on that also fathers who are either not informed, or also when they watch what's going on. Now, we know with Leah Thomas what she went through. We know what a certain medical gains has said. And again, I understand where she's coming from, but the language and the way she herself, this young woman from the University of Kentucky, is being used because she was beaten by Leah Thomas, the way she's been used to push an agenda, and it just seems to be very, very dangerous in that. I will say that it's not just cis women, it is dads of daughters. And honestly, that is true. Good God, I'm scared.
And like I wake to that every day. So I wake up to that, and I've actually written to Thomas Bach back in January, my concerns, because I feel like I'm on this carousel, because I feel like I'm still part of this. I know why we're here and why this has happened, and I feel that I'm a participant in this. And colleagues tell me I've got to stop feeling this way. It's purely, this is 1,000% the issue of the IOC, and their inability to tell the public what happened. But they're making me carry that burden. But in terms of Leah Thomas, the other thing is too, there's a few athletes like Leah, and I don't want to take away from their experience, but their participation in sport is based on the Toronto policy that was designed specifically for the legal process in Toronto. So not fault of theirs is not understanding that, because the IOC never said anything, obviously, because it's what we call statement against interest. So they kept that private until I re-engaged with them over the last couple of years, and the pivot that they've recently gone through. But the thing is that those athletes thought the IOC at that time did the science and the research to the policy to which they, within the NCAA or within the UCI or other international sports, are participating, to which there's no science and research to the policy. And that wasn't that, and that is specifically to the issues of the IOC. So you've got the unfortunate thing, we've got this label of trans, and what it's done is it's kind of created this kind of umbrella with all these different body types, that athletes who have been through transition are very different physiologies, and they have very different impacts to their physiology than somebody who is basically hypogonadic due to the lowering of their testosterone. So, and the impact to my body and to other athletes like myself like Laurel Hubbard, for instance, which I can talk to you very quickly because I think this is really important to this discussion, is that when we're talking about power sports and things like that, we knew back in 2017 that Laurel was going to get in trouble potentially at the Commonwealth Games in Queensland, to which she inevitably blew out her elbow. But we sent out letters 2 weeks before warning the organizers of the Commonwealth Games Federation that we were seeing changes. And I had not met Laurel at this time, that were both New Zealanders, by the way, had not met her by this time, but I could see the changes in her physiology that I was kind of concerned, because we knew, because of her transition and her weight gain and other things, she had assumed the IOC had done the science and the research to the policies to which she was participating in weightlifting. Of course, they hadn't. And we were concerned about the elasticity and the health and well-being of her joints and the weight bearing, which is the need and stimulation of testosterone to help the health of those ligaments and the joint health. To which, inevitably, as you're aware of, she blew out her elbow and had a catastrophic injury, to which we anticipated. So there's a whole series of documents that shows that process. And then later in Japan in 2021, here we have the IOC pivoting, and it hadn't been public yet. So that July, I was on a conference call with the International Olympic Committee because they knew I was doing all these international interviews, and they were trying to get me to talk about to the international public about fairness. She met all the criteria, so on and so on. And the IOC even had the Prime Minister of Jacinda believing what they were saying. And I told the IOC, I'm not going to do that, because Laurel, as did the New Zealand Olympic Committee, believed that you had, and the World Weightlifting Organization believed that you did the science and the research, the policies to which she met the criteria you call that she met to participate. None of it's true. And in fact, it's a threat to her participation on the field of play. And we need to safeguard her. So the issue was, as we had that 6-month buildup, everybody that was impacting her in the world media and all the horrible things that were said about her, not understanding what was going behind the scenes, I was sending documents to the heads of the New Zealand Olympic Committee and to the New Zealand Sports Federation and to her coach through various channels to help educate them, because they didn't have the resources, because the IOC didn't have it to supply to them, because I'm the one who has it, to which then we wanted to ensure her safety on the field of play. The issue was, first of all, Laurel didn't get to the Olympic Games based on so much on her performance. It was because during COVID-19, there was an attrition where other athletes couldn't come to other nations couldn't come to the games. So through that attrition, she was brought up the list that she was able to participate. She didn't get past the first round, right? And that's 10 years into her transition from her surgical intervention of her body. So that's when she had complete androgen deprivation and complete failure of her physiology. I got calls the following day from colleagues from internationally, and they said, the world's waking up to a very different story, aren't they? And I said, yes, they are. And the fact was, Laurel's participation in Japan was not a success. That is a kid who felt that the IOC had done all the work to get her there, untrue. And she had gone through all the loops, unaware of the risks that she was taking to her health and well-being on the field of play, and to which she barely got through. She didn't even get through the first round in Japan.
No.
She was completely unaware of that, other than the surroundings of the media and everybody downplaying her participation in the first place, and not recognizing that how the position she was as an athlete and the threat to her well-being on the field of play and injury, right? And then she didn't get past the first round because her body couldn't support it.
No. She like
her mental well-being as well, that she was allowed to risk.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
Right.
we covered on the show at the time. And we were discussing it and then saying, no matter what, it's a human being. We have to think about being kind to them in some way. And, just because there's so much rhetoric about it, and people going, she has to compete to show how trans people can compete. And I'm like, wait, hold on, wait. And then there's people going, she can't compete because she's trans. I'm like, wait, hold on. There's two sides pushing her, and only when you were on us, we were able to figure out that, not figure out, we were told she shouldn't have been there in the first place. But By the way, Kristen, how is she doing now? Andrew, I know you're waiting patiently.
I
How is she doing now, Kristen?
I haven't been
Sorry.
in touch with her. I think, I mean, I know she has a lot of support with her family and so on. I haven't been in touch with her, and actually much of my associations to New Zealand in the last few months because I've been very busy here with other things. So I'm assuming that she's fine and going on with the rest of her life. But I think if I can just mention two things to you guys as well, just while we're on this topic, is I'll never forget when I was in Lausanne back in November 1st, 2019, when I went with the IOC privately. And I had Richard Budgett, who was the IOC Medical Commission director, as you now know, who replaced Arnie Link, was sitting beside me for 8 hours on my left hand side of me all day long. And as many of you I don't have many of you read the new policy statement, but the focus on health and well-being and long-term participation. I'll never forget Richard saying to me in his British accent throughout, I mentioned it like 5 times throughout the day, and he goes, "Kristen," in his British accent, "I really like this idea around health and well-being." And I said, "Oh, that's really great, Richard," you know. But I mean, so when we come back to the beginning of this question around SEBCO, and as you were talking at the top of this discussion, is that the issue is that SEBCO knows all of this. The issue is that there are no elite athletes, transition athletes in world athletics because their bodies can't support it. Period. Okay, so it's never an issue. It's not an issue in sport. What SEBCO did, and I'm quite happy to say it because it is the truth. He was looking for votes because it was his third time, and he mentioned it on the day that he got voted in for his third time as CEO of World Athletics, and that it's also about money. It's also about his base and the conservative base to which the IAF finds itself within the UAE and North Africa, to which they get support now within those conservative environments. So that's who he's selling himself to. The issue is, so what he did, just like we're seeing in the United States with a lot of conservative movements in this space, they're using it on the back of the most vulnerable people to gain their support of their bases, to elevate them and to finance them.
Andrew, jump in. It's over to you.
Kristen, I actually do want to ask you something here. I want to mildly play devil's advocate here. From what you've said, it's firstly, I'd like to thank you for educating me, because a lot of this is something that even I've never heard, and I think the wider public have never heard. But my question for you is, it seems clear to me that World Athletics, in not specifically the organisation, but as a whole, as a sport, clearly is not prepared for transgender athletes. Whether that is the systems put in place to safeguard them, to ensure level competition, world sport does not seem ready at the moment. The way it's been dressed up, as say the quote that we all read about SEBCO saying publicly this is to safeguard female athletes, clearly is not the full picture, but is allowing transgender athletes to compete openly the right way to go? Is there more work that needs to be done to protect transgender athletes before we can honestly say this is the right thing? Because the whole picture appears to have been framed as, is it fair, is it not? Is it fair to female athletes or not? I mean, I don't even know what the answer is, but what would you say right now? Would you say it should?
A couple things. Yeah, you're right on it. Great questions, and it's hard to do in the time frame that we're in. I think first of all, I'll come back to Japan when I was on the call with the IOC privately behind the scenes, and they're trying to get me to reword these things, and they kept coming back with the issue of fairness. That issue of fairness comes out of their marketing. It's them trying to keep connected to their base. Okay. Again, I come back to the issue around the difference in human physiology. So you've got the transition athletes who've gone through the complete transition, who are bodies are highly impacted, and we know over the period of time that physiology will fail. Okay, because it doesn't have the gas and the engine to support the motor. Okay, the body will fail. Okay, and that's the liability the IOC has known about since 2006. Okay, because they never did the science and the research, and that's why they did what they did in Toronto. That's why removing sex reassignment, because they knew it was an enormous liability, because they knew it was problematic. Okay, so it was only when I got outside the court, outside of the cast, because they would have controlled the cast, they would have politicized it, and they would never have seen a civil response to it, right? They would have manipulated it, and sex reassignment would still be a prerequisite in policy today if I hadn't taken them outside of the system, right? Because they had to answer to that. That's really important. So when you're talking about, let's use transgendered athletes, the ones who haven't had the surgical intervention of their fault. So the transition athletes we need to protect. We need to safeguard those athletes. That's why in 2009, I was given a TUE. Because we understood when you take the primary hormone of the body loses that stimulation. Okay? And my body was failing. Okay? The science is clear. Okay? And we knew that back in 2009. We actually knew that beforehand, but 2009 the TUE was dated. Okay? So the issue is that you've got the transgendered athletes who are not had the surgical intervention, who do not have those same impacts to their physiology, and where we now know in Toronto, it was a legal scheme that the IOC had cooked up with their lawyers to limit the liability. So the issue is that you've got the participating athletes in the system today with that policy in place, without the science and the research, that has now kind of been hyper bold under this umbrella as all of us being the same, which they're not the same. And so that's the education piece, Andrew, I think where you're coming to. And I think that's the problem. And I think it's also important to remember too, the IAAF, or now WA, is the incubator for gender historically. Okay. So there is no reason for the World Athletics, as we know them today, to be in this position. Okay. There is zero reason for this, other than them not trying to curtail to the audience to which they politically are associated, to which they receive funding, and the nations to which they acquire votes and funding to support their athletic events. Period. There is no reason for this, because there is coming back to your question, there is no example that Seb Coe, if you phone him up today or send him an email or ask World Athletics, their marketing guys, to send you an example, they couldn't give you one. They couldn't give you one.
What really almost unsettles me, I think, the most is that it seems, I mean, Kristen, look, there are many athletes who, as you've described, it's not one block. There is a very, very vast range of physiologies. I don't even know the right terms to use myself, so I apologize if I used the wrong way to explain. But there doesn't seem a clear way for these athletes who want to compete, but for them to compete safely for themselves. The whole argument seems to be the safety of others. But what is the right way to approach it? The education has to start. The education that you've given us on this show alone, that needs to start. But for the actual sport to move forward, including all athletes, how? I don't understand what needs to be, how it works.
Alan was mentioning this to me before I came on, and it really comes down to the IOC. This comes down to the organization where this all systemically started back 20 years ago. The IOC now has published in the British Medical Journal fully the historical record, and it was published back just this past December, on the 16th of December, of this complete pivot. The IOC knows clearly the problem. They are the ones that need to come publicly and to say to publicly, we have done harm. We are responsible for this, period. Because that's why they're deadly silent right now, because they know they are completely complicit with this problem. So when I'm having to go out, unfortunately, to be able to, because I feel so paralyzed from it, because they're keeping me on this carousel of knowledge, because they don't want the public to know what they had done over this 2-decade period. including my own government. My own government participated in it because they were fearful of losing their association to the Olympic movement at the cost of my career. Over a decade, the UCI did the very same action, okay? And it was only on the deathbed, literally weeks before Hein Vubergen, who was the past president of the UCI, he would look me up personally, called me, and responded and apologized for his historical association to what had happened. And that was before Hein passed in 2017. So there is a whole historical record here to which even the UCI, when we were going, which I posted today, if you look at the minutes that happened here in Toronto, the UCI was so concerned about losing their every 4 years, the IOC gives out funding to all the different IFs, and depending on where you sit within the hierarchy, the UCI, cycling sits in the top 3 tier. They were paralyzed by going from doing the right thing to being fearful of losing and pulling the IOC down in the court case because of losing their funding. So they were trying to balance between their morals and the ethics of what they knew and the impact to me as an athlete, as a survivor, against the costs to which the IOC was sitting in the back channels saying, we're going to pull your funding from you. We need to protect you. But you need to protect us from this and take the hit for this, right? And which was completely the IOC's doing. And I'll never forget then Brian Cookson, who was just let go, replaced by David Leperrin. This was in November 2017. I played the game. He came up to me and played the game, and he said, "Oh, I recognize that face." And this is just after we finished the legal piece in Toronto. And he goes, "Kristen, you know this is all about protecting the IOC." So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the politic and the protection of a global organization that was given the responsibility, carte blanche to the public, to global sport, to help educate and ensure the proper integration of athletes, no matter their background, into sport safely and healthy. Blah 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 blah. The IOC has failed to do that, and for the last 20 years, all they've tried to do is to try to pivot from that responsibility.
Let's put it this way, Brian Cookson, we had a solicitor's letter from many years ago on the radio show when we pointed out some of the things that he had done when he was, for example, he was a commissar in the period of the dirtiest racing period in cycling history, saw nothing, reported nothing. He, of course, took over from Pat McQuaid, the Irish ex-cyclist and former head of the UCI, promised to clean up. This was after overseeing the renaissance, not a renaissance, they just were never good before. British cycling suddenly started winning medals. Team Sky suddenly started winning tours.
Right.
And Brian Cookson takes over, and suddenly all the laptops with Dr. Freeman, all the scandals buried, very, very quickly buried. So these people, it's never about the athletes. It's never about the sport.
No.
It's about themselves. It's about the power. It's about the junkets. It's about the blazer. It's about the money. And if they just step back for 1 second and thought about it, they would be ashamed of themselves.
Can I mention one thing just while we're on that?
Go ahead, before we are wrapping up. So
as I mentioned earlier in our conversation about Thomas Bach being down at the talking about the Rio at the Rio press conference back in 2016, he spoke about this kind of blanket approach to treating athletes who are transgendered, right? And then it was just before the June before the back in 2021, just before the Olympics, the Japan Olympics, he's talking about how it was an individual approach. So that happened because we did the work. Thomas finally learned by doing the work how this individually impacts an individual and how these are individual applications. And that's how the human physiology works. It's not something that can be blanketed. And it's something that I talk about a lot about, is where we talk about androgen receptor uptake, and everybody's bodies are individual. So it works completely differently from person to person to person. So you can't create this simplistic umbrella. You can't create a system to which we are trying to engulf a certain label of individual into sport and assuming that that's going to work for everybody. Doesn't work that way.
Kristen, I'm going to ask you 3 quick questions myself, and I'm going to allow Andrew and Liesl, just ask one quick question each. Very, very short answers, one sentence answer only, because we're
I'll try my best.
way over time. So, Thomas Bach as a person, good or bad for sport? Oh, Jesus, I thought it was an easy question.
I believe, if I can say quickly, I believe he is searching for his end game, and I think he's trying to do the right thing, but trying to work within a politic that is much darker, much more difficult. And I'm going to use the word darker because there is some darkness to it.
Yeah.
That he is fighting within. I think there's some sides of him that is the right intent. But I just, there are challenges which he's facing, which are pretty dark. And I don't believe,
Again, I see a lot of the decency about him. People who've dealt with him say great decency to him, but you're at the top of a huge organization. You have to play the game. Simple as that.
But just really quickly, being that we did all this work just on the gender piece, him being quiet is problematic.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
that's a problem.
Yeah. Now, one second. Second one issue that keeps coming up in America all the time. We've seen it in Florida, the behavior there of Rick DeSantis and Ron DeSantis. Is that right? Ron
DeSantis, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Rick DeSantis is from This Era 22 Minutes in Canada. He's a guy from Nova Scotia. Isn't Rick DeSantis? I think it is. He's a comedian. Anyway, I always mix you up. But
Rick Mercer.
Rick Mercer. There you go. I don't know why it's DeSantis. Rick Mercer. There you go. They look alike. I know they look alike.
Different personalities.
Exactly. Yeah. Rick Mercer, much nicer guy. I met him at the baggage belt in Halifax Airport many years ago. One of the things that's been brought up again and again is at what age should children be, let's just say, brought to a transition or be allowed to transition? This seems to be very problematic. Do you have a view on that, or
I certainly do, and I work with WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgendered Health, some of the very top experts in the world. I believe that, first of all, I just want to say two things. Young people do not receive hormones until 17, 18 years old, and there is no surgical intervention until at least after 18. So that is just for the record. And usually there's a 2-year interface with therapists and support that is ongoing. And it's the WPATH assessment now is fully integrated and now it's been individualized. It just came out this past year, the new version of it. And I believe, because of what I went through, I shared my own personal experience. I knew, like, when I was 4 and 5, 6 years of age and living a very difficult cross life, even at that age, which I didn't understand. I grew up in a conservative Canadian family. I was adopted. And I did not know why these things were happening to me, even at that age. So it affects your relationships, your development, your education, every aspect of your life. So for me, I tried to commit suicide 3 times in my life. And a lot of that had to deal with me feeling I didn't understand this. And secondly, I felt that I was failing my family. And it was purely a biological break. It's purely biological, as we now know. So the issue for me, to have the right support and infrastructure in place, done well, the younger the better. Because also there's less surgical intervention, there's less all other physical interventions to help the child to transition earlier on in life and to get on with their life and developing that healthy foundation. The child actually knows more than the parents do. That's the problem, is that the individual living the experience knows at 4, 5, and 6 years old, and they're trying to adapt within a world that wasn't designed for them, right? And they're trying to figure that out, to why this is happening in a world that is over here yelling and screaming at them, telling them that they're not good for society. They don't belong here in society. So that is very concerning to me from the public health standpoint, but I also am concerned with young people taking their lives and the mental health impact it's going to have on them. So that is a very big concern.
Andrew, I'll go to you first to quick last question.
Well, I think my biggest concern is Okay, look, I mean, I don't understand the deep details, the history remotely in the depth that you do, Kristen. But my concern is, just on a purely sporting point of view, will sport ever be in a position where it is actually genuinely possible for athletes, regardless of whether they are transitioning, have transitioned, are transgender, or are not remotely in that area at all, to all compete on a level playing field, in a safe playing field, and an unpoliticized playing field? Is that actually even possible? I mean, the problem I have is Sebco calling it a ban. Is there any element of it that, for the time being, it's safer to just say, look, we can't have a level playing field because it is not level or safe for everybody involved?
Well, first, I'm hearing, Andrew, I really appreciate your question. And I think to answer that fully, I think it has to happen at the grassroots levels and at the club levels. Sebco, again, as I mentioned earlier, Sebco has no example to draw from. He's doing it purely for political reasons.
Yeah.
And as I said to you, call them up, ask for an example from the marketing people at World Athletics. They're not going to be able to give you one. So elite sport is 0.1% of society that actually are competing in sport. So he's saying something foolishly. It's impactful. It's negatively impactful to communities globally, to which he has no connection to. Right, he lives in that 0.1%. Right, so what he is saying is he will never see. He has no examples of that. And then at the same time, he's like what happened with World Aquatics. It's the same thing. They're negatively impacting the community outreach and places for young people to participate actively in their communities and in sports. So again, coming back to the part of your question to answer this as well, is the work that we do with the IOC and what the IOC just published in the British Medical Journal in its fullest form. That is the example. So it comes back to the IOC. We can do it, but it takes stewardship to do that. And it takes the IOC to come forward and say to the world, we are responsible for this. And we need to now responsibly go forward. And they have not been able to do that because they're afraid of the legal liabilities that are attached to this historical record. And that is what's preventing this from going forward, even though they've published what they've published.
Isolt, last question for you.
I suppose I'd hoped we'd get a chance to, and hopefully we will again, to touch on what's going on in America in terms of a lot of conservative candidates deciding to run with the idea of a political stance around the Biden administration's view of extending Title IX protections. And I think it's a very worrying thing where we are risking athletes and young people being, I suppose, singled out generically, as in across the board, without naming. It's not naming Aaliyah Thomas. It's any of these athletes who want to participate, being singled out by politicians in a really dangerous way. And I suppose you've mentioned how it's extremely difficult for you on a day-to-day basis to think of these young people and these people across the board who are at risk. What can be done, and do you think there's a place for the IOC now to come out and be much more vocal, because they're making clear that the assumptions people have worked on have been false? Would that assist in pushing forward the idea that we are singling people out incorrectly and stop politicians weaponizing young people and young athletes?
Yes, I 1,000%. And I think also, if you can use the NCAA as an example, the IOC, let's see where this has happened within the United States. So the policy pivots to which the NCAA has done has been solely based on the willful blindness of the NCAA absorbing the policies of the IOC. So they historically they've hit on each one of them, and all of a sudden they've had this 180-degree pivot after we released back on the 17th or 18th of November, 2021, the new policy piece. They immediately instigated without even understanding how the IOC got there. They didn't call and ask the IOC, why is this 180-degree pivot? And the idea behind it also was about changing when we designed it, because it was focused on health and well-being and long-term participation, because we understood the trauma, the maltreatment, and the historical record of all of this. We understood why this is happening. And so the NCAA didn't ask those questions. All they did was carte blanche and through willful blindness, just like the Canadian government did all those years ago when I got gender tested. They accepted policies from the IOC because they're the assumed authority. We gave them the assumed authority of sport to deal with these policies in a way that we assume that they were doing the work when actually in fact we weren't doing anything. So that's where this has happened. So with the NCAA is equally as fault for having willful blindness for not asking those questions. So for Leah Thomas, and I'm not picking on the athlete, but let's using it as an example, is that they did not inform that athlete on the terms of because they didn't understand the policy. Either did the athlete understand the policy, assuming the IOC had done the work, that also they just thought, okay, we're just going to go do this, right? And the problem is that no one knew, and except for the IOC knowing that we never did it, and we're not going to tell anybody because we know it's a problem. So that's how we got there. I think first of all we need to understand how we got there, and the weaponizing question that you're talking about is part of that, because I think we'll always have bad people in the world, and we'll have opinionated people in the world, and I think, but I truly believe, and there's some people in sport who we all know personally, kind of the higher levels to where some of this is being projected negatively. I don't believe they're necessarily bad people. I know them personally. I've had discussions with them personally about this, and they know better. The issue is the system itself, and those who were given the responsibility to do this right in the first place, has failed sport. They failed the general public, and unfortunately now, it has now been, because of Donald Trump and the shifts that we're seeing in the conservative movement in the United States, much what happened in the gay movement years ago. They found a way to elevate their base and energize their base through something that affects 0.1% of society, which most people don't even know even existed until 2020, when all this started being weaponized. So that's how this has happened. I truly believe, and I'm going to say quite clearly, this is a failure of the International Olympic Committee, full stop. And is them having to come to the public. They have now published the work. They've now published in the BMJ very clearly that historical record. They didn't come to that by accident. And that they have a responsibility to the public and to the sporting system to be able to say, we are responsible for this. We have done harm, and we need to educate the global system of sport to help move this forward. Period.
Yeah.
On that note, that's exactly how we want to end. It's like how we step past this, how we make it better, how we make sport inclusive, how we make what we all love, sport, fully part of everybody's lives. And, when we hear people say, I don't like sport, that's a load of bullshit, because you'd never say the same about music, about theatre, about cinema. Okay, you might say, I hate Marvel movies because they're trash, but I love movies. But sport should be for everybody, should be open for all, and hopefully we get there. So, Andrew Flint, Isla Cody, Kristen Worley, thank you so much for your brilliant time tonight.
Nice.
Okay. Just so everyone knows, we are starting an hour earlier next week, so we're on from 8 p.m. CET, that's 7 p.m. in Huskyland. So until next week, I'm more saying thank you very, very much for being with us this evening. Take care of yourselves. Of course, take care of each other.